Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for bringing your expertise on this important issue. I also serve on the Education and Workforce Committee, and I'm going to focus at first on some of the workforce issues, making sure that we have the workforce that we need to continue addressing this serious issue. And I know, Mr. Stacy, you said that the demand for trained cyber defenders with control systems knowledge vastly exceeds the supply. Now, my alma mater, the University of Oregon, has just created an Oregon Center for Cybersecurity and Privacy. They received some federal funding and a Center of Excellence designation. And they plan to begin enrolling students by next summer. But how can we incentivize more universities to support educating this workforce? And once we have a strong pipeline of students and get them into the workforce, how can we attract them to public service and government jobs when typically the private sector would pay more and be perceived as more innovative? So I'll start with Ms. Lee and also ask Mr. Wilshusen and anybody who wants to weigh in.
As I noted in my statement, I previously was in the Federal Government for 14 years. I think one of the real advantages of working in the Federal Government is the kind of work you can do and the impact that you have. I mentioned the Guidelines for Smart Grid Cybersecurity product that we developed. There were 150 volunteers from around the world that participated in developing that document. These were senior-level people literally around the world. I kept getting asked, do you pay these people? And my response was, no, these are volunteers. I think one thing in the Federal Government and working with the Federal Government for several decades, you can have an impact and influence that you don't have anywhere else. And to me, that's a real benefit for working in the public sector. Private sector does compete. It is difficult now. There are very few, as mentioned earlier, there are not significant numbers of people who are in cybersecurity, and those who focus on control systems. And as I mentioned, there are some basic differences between cybersecurity for control systems and our IT systems. That community is even smaller. We need to beef up that workforce. There are controls that you don't put on OT systems that are typical on IT systems. And we definitely need to grow this area.
And do you agree with Mr. Stacy that there's a serious need that we don't have the workforce?
We don't have the workforce.
I want to follow up because I know the U of O Center is going to be working with the faculty from several different departments, including computer and information science, philosophy, business, law. What role, you talked about the role of human behavior, but how can we really capitalize on understanding human behavior to deal with the threats and also hopefully to be out in front and prevent them? I'll open it up to the panel. Ms. Lee, do you want to start?
As you mentioned, I think human behavior is very important. Historically, and I've been doing cybersecurity now for almost 3 decades, the solution was have longer passwords, and so what does everybody do? They write them down because you can't remember 12 or 15-character passwords that you have to change every 3 or 4 months.
We've all done that.
Yeah. And yeah, you write them down. That's the only way you can remember them, is to look at cybersecurity, and the solution has to be, yes, we need to figure it out. This, as I say, it's a messy environment. If you look at the reality of cybersecurity, the devices that are out there, the controls you may need to implement, you can't do. You either can't afford them or they affect the performance. You need to figure out the solutions. And I think that's the direction that cybersecurity needs to go. Historically,
thank you. And I need to get a couple more questions. And Mr. Gaines, you talked about the TIM, the Threat Intelligence Management. That seems like a sound approach. What are the barriers to improving and expanding that approach?
The barriers are twofold. One, there are limitations that industry has today in communicating with the government vulnerabilities. And that is a real challenge in that we are limited to some extent because we hold the liability if there's a breach or vulnerability to the network. I think that needs to be looked at and in some cases eliminated so that we can share openly very specific information about vulnerabilities. The second is the actual technologies themselves. Today, we are one of only 2 utilities that have a completely integrated security operations center. And Ms. Lee spoke about that center. It's a center that we integrate the physical, being badge access, building access. we integrate the IT being the cyber component, and we integrate the operational, the SCADA systems together. All three of those systems are actually monitored, reviewed, and we take actions against events. And I'll use a simple analogy so you could understand.
I'm afraid my time's going to expire. Can I have just a few more seconds, Mr. Chairman?
Without objection.
I want to get a quick question for Mr. Wilshusen. You mentioned in your testimony that FERC was adopting standards from NIST's efforts, but according to FERC officials, the statute did not provide any authority to allow FERC to require the smart grid technologies to follow the standards, and now it's voluntary. How's that working?
Well, it is voluntary, and that's one of the problems that we noted is that FERC is not, because it's voluntary and has not been adopted, it has not gone out to examine the effectiveness or the extent to which those voluntary standards have been implemented.
Thank you, and I'm very over time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.